Symptoms of a bad ignition switch. An ignition switch is an electrical switch used in vehicles to start and stop the engine. It is typically located on or near the steering column, within easy reach of the driver. The ignition switch has multiple positions, including off, accessory, on, and start. When the key or ignition button is turned to the accessory position, power is supplied to electrical components such as the radio and power windows, allowing them to be used without starting the engine. In the on position, power is provided to the vehicle's electrical systems, including the fuel pump, ignition system, and dashboard lights. This position prepares the vehicle for starting by allowing the engine control unit, ECU, to carry out self-tests and power various systems. When the key or button is turned to the start position, it activates the starter motor, which cranks the engine and initiates the combustion process. The ignition switch also sends signals to the fuel and ignition systems, allowing fuel to be injected and spark plugs to ignite the air-fuel mixture in the engine cylinders. Once the engine starts running, the key or button is released, and it returns to the on position, supplying power to the engine and other electrical systems while the vehicle is in operation. Overall, the ignition switch plays a crucial role in controlling the electrical power flow to various components, allowing the driver to start, stop, and operate the vehicle. Symptoms of bad ignition switch. A faulty or failing ignition switch can exhibit several symptoms. Here are some common signs that may indicate a problem with the ignition switch. 1. Engine not starting or intermittent starting. A failing ignition switch may prevent the engine from starting when the key is turned to the start position. The engine may not crank at all, or it may start occasionally but fail to start consistently. 2. No power to electrical accessories. When the ignition switch is turned to the on position, it supplies power to various electrical components such as the radio, lights, and power windows. If these accessories fail to operate or work intermittently, it could indicate a faulty ignition switch. 3. Stalling while driving. A malfunctioning ignition switch may cause the engine to stall suddenly while driving. This can result in a loss of power steering, power brakes, and other electrical functions. 4. Difficulty turning the key. If you experience difficulty turning the key in the ignition switch or if the key gets stuck in the switch, it could be a sign of a worn-out or damaged ignition switch. 5. Warning lights and gauges behaving erratically. A faulty ignition switch can cause fluctuations in the operation of dashboard warning lights and gauges. They may flicker, dim, or behave erratically while driving. 6. Problems with the ignition lock cylinder. The ignition lock cylinder is part of the ignition switch assembly. If you have trouble inserting or removing the key from the ignition lock cylinder, it may indicate a problem with the ignition switch. 7. Engine dies immediately after starting. If the engine starts but dies as soon as you release the key from the start position to the on position, it could be a sign of a faulty ignition switch. 8. Loss of power to the electrical system. A failing ignition switch may cause a sudden loss of power to the electrical system while the engine is running. This can lead to the headlights, dashboard lights, or other electrical components turning off unexpectedly. 9. Random or intermittent starting issues. The ignition switch may work intermittently, causing the engine to start and run normally on some occasions but not on others. This inconsistent behavior is a clear indication of a potential problem with the switch. 10. Key does not return to the on position. After starting the engine, if the key does not spring back to the on position on its own, or if you have to manually turn it back to the on position, it could suggest a faulty ignition switch. 11. Burning smell or smoke. In severe cases, a malfunctioning ignition switch may generate heat and cause a burning smell or smoke to emanate from the switch or steering column area. This is a serious issue that should be addressed immediately. It's important to note that these symptoms can also be caused by other electrical or mechanical issues in the vehicle. If you suspect a faulty ignition switch based on these symptoms, it is recommended to have it inspected and repaired by a qualified mechanic. They will be able to diagnose the exact cause of the issue and perform the necessary repairs or replacement. What causes ignition switch to fail? There are several potential causes for an ignition switch to fail or become faulty. Some common factors that can contribute to ignition switch failure include 1. Age-related wear and tear. Over time, the mechanical components within the ignition switch can wear out due to repeated use. The internal contacts and electrical connections may become worn or damaged, leading to malfunctions or failures. Ignition switches, like many other components in a vehicle, have a limited lifespan. As a vehicle ages and accumulates mileage, the internal components of the ignition switch can deteriorate, leading to failure. 2. Electrical issues. The ignition switch relies on electrical connections to transmit power and signals to various components in the vehicle. If there are electrical problems, such as corrosion, loose connections, or short circuits, it can affect the proper functioning of the ignition switch. 3. Excessive keychain weight. Carrying a heavy keychain with multiple keys, trinkets, or accessories can put additional stress on the ignition switch. The weight and movement of the keychain can cause the internal components of the switch to wear out prematurely. 4. Ignition lock cylinder issues. The ignition lock cylinder is the part of the ignition switch where the key is inserted. If the lock cylinder becomes worn, damaged, or jammed, it can affect the operation of the ignition switch, leading to failure or difficulties in starting the engine. 5. Manufacturing defects. In some cases, ignition switch failure can be attributed to manufacturing defects or design flaws. These defects can manifest as premature wear, poor electrical connections, or other issues that can affect the switch's reliability. 6. Environmental factors. Harsh environmental conditions, such as extreme temperatures, moisture, or exposure to contaminants, can accelerate the deterioration of the ignition switch components and lead to failure over time. 7. Overheating. The ignition switch can be subjected to excessive heat, especially if it is located near the engine or in an area that is prone to high temperatures. Prolonged exposure to heat can cause the internal components of the switch to degrade or malfunction. 8. Contamination. The ignition switch can become contaminated with dirt, debris, or fluids over time. This contamination can interfere with the smooth operation of the switch, leading to problems such as sticking, intermittent operation, or complete failure. 9. Improper installation or repairs. If the ignition switch was not installed correctly or if previous repairs were performed poorly, it can contribute to its failure. Incorrect wiring, loose connections, or improper alignment can cause the switch to malfunction. 10. Physical damage. Accidental impacts, forceful handling, or attempts at theft can result in physical damage to the ignition switch. Cracked housings, bent or broken internal components, or damaged electrical connections can all lead to switch failure. 11. Electrical system issues. Problems within the vehicle's electrical system, such as voltage spikes or surges, can impact the performance and longevity of the ignition switch. Excessive electrical load, faulty wiring, or issues with the battery or alternator can contribute to switch failure. It's important to remember that these factors are not exhaustive, and there may be other causes specific to certain vehicle models or circumstances. It's important to note that the specific causes of ignition switch failure can vary depending on the make and model of the vehicle, as well as other factors. How to care for the ignition switch. Caring for the ignition switch can help maintain its proper functioning and extend its lifespan. Here are some tips to care for the ignition switch. 1. Avoid excessive weight on the keychain. Carrying a heavy keychain with multiple keys, accessories, or trinkets can put unnecessary stress on the ignition switch. Minimize the weight on your keychain to reduce strain on the switch. 2. Use the correct key. Always use the correct key for your vehicle's ignition switch. Using the wrong key or a poorly fitting key can cause damage to the lock cylinder and the switch itself. 3. Keep the switch and keyhole clean. regularly inspect the ignition switch and keyhole for any dirt, debris, or contaminants. If you notice any buildup, gently clean the area using a soft cloth or a small brush. Be careful not to push any debris into the keyhole. 4. Avoid excessive force or rough handling. Handle the ignition switch and key with care. Avoid applying excessive force or using rough handling when inserting or turning the key, as it can cause damage to the switch or the lock cylinder. 5. Address electrical issues promptly. If you notice any electrical issues related to the ignition switch, such as flickering lights or intermittent operation, have them addressed by a qualified mechanic. Electrical problems can potentially affect the performance of the switch, so it's important to address them promptly. 6. Regular maintenance. Follow the manufacturer's recommended maintenance schedule for your vehicle. Regular maintenance, such as inspections and tune-ups, can help identify any potential issues with the ignition switch or other components and address them before they become major problems. 7. Seek professional assistance. If you suspect any issues with the ignition switch, such as difficulty starting the vehicle or other abnormalities, it's best to consult a qualified mechanic. They can perform a thorough inspection, diagnose any problems, and provide the necessary repairs or replacements. 8. Lubricate the lock cylinder. Periodically lubricate the lock cylinder of the ignition switch with a small amount of graphite powder or a specialized lock lubricant. This can help maintain smooth operation and prevent sticking or binding of the key. 9. Protect from moisture and extreme temperatures. Moisture and extreme temperatures can be detrimental to the ignition switch. Avoid exposing the switch to excessive moisture or extreme heat or cold. If your vehicle is parked outside in harsh weather conditions, consider using a car cover or finding shelter to protect the switch. 10. Check for recalls or service bulletins. Stay informed about any recalls or service bulletins related to your vehicle's ignition switch. Manufacturers sometimes issue recalls or provide recommendations for specific models due to known issues. Check with your vehicle manufacturer or authorized dealer to ensure your ignition switch is in compliance with any updates or necessary repairs. 11. Avoid forcing the key. If you encounter resistance or difficulty when turning the key in the ignition switch, avoid applying excessive force or trying to force the key to turn. This can potentially damage the switch or the key. Instead, try gently wiggling the key or turning it back slightly before attempting to turn it again. 12. Regularly inspect and test the switch. Periodically inspect the ignition switch for any signs of physical damage, such as cracks or loose parts. Additionally, test the switch by turning it through its various positions, off, accessory, on, start, to ensure it operates smoothly and reliably. If you notice any abnormalities or issues during the inspection or testing, have the switch inspected and repaired by a qualified mechanic. By following these care tips and addressing any issues promptly, you can help ensure the longevity and proper functioning of your vehicle's ignition switch. Remember, proper care and maintenance of the ignition switch, along with regular vehicle maintenance, can help ensure its longevity and reliable operation. If you have any specific concerns or questions about caring for your vehicle's ignition switch, consulting the owner's manual or contacting the vehicle manufacturer or authorized dealer can provide you with more specific guidelines and recommendations. That's all we have for you in today's video. It's very good to have you here on our channel. If you liked the video, please smash the like button and do consider subscribing if you haven't already. We hope to see you soon with another video. Until then, stay safe.